Welcome back to our channel. Nicole could still smell the perfume. It lingered in the hallway like a ghost refusing to leave. Shanice's perfume, sharp, expensive, confident. It clung to the air and to the skin of the man who once swore she was the only one he'd ever need. Ted's shirt was still damp with traces of it when Nicole found it, crumpled near the bed, next to the sheets that no longer carried her scent. There was no confrontation, no screams. Just silence, the kind that crushes bones. In that silence, something inside her split. It wasn't the kind of clean break that leaves two separate halves. It was jagged, uneven, like glass fracturing beneath pressure, cutting everything it touched. She stared at the evidence of betrayal and felt her heartbeat slow until it almost stopped. Her first instinct was to run, but she couldn't. Running would mean surrendering, and surrendering would mean accepting that Shanice had won. So Nicole stood still and let the rage ferment inside her, dark and slow like poison thickening in her veins. Days became nights without distinction. Ted continued to smile, continued to lie with the ease of a man who believed he could manipulate fate itself. Shanice, flawless and untouchable, carried herself with the grace of a woman who had never lost anything. But Nicole watched them both from the quiet corners of their world, the dinner parties, the charity galas, the small whispers behind closed doors, and she learned. She learned the way Shanice tilted her head when she lied. She learned the way Ted's pupils widened when he was caught between guilt and desire. She began to map their movements like a scientist studying disease. Her anger was no longer wild. It was disciplined, sharpened. What once was pain turned into strategy. She started making small moves, rearranging things in their shared lives, changing schedules, planting thoughts. Ted began to feel that something was off, though he couldn't say what. Shanice sensed it too, a subtle coldness that spread through every space Nicole entered. The air itself grew heavier, as though the walls of the Dupree estate, so bright, so polished, were absorbing the tension and holding their breath. Nicole didn't seek sympathy. She didn't want redemption. What she wanted was equilibrium. The kind that could only return when everything Ted and Shanice had built collapsed the same way her trust had. And yet, even as she planned, a part of her ached. A quieter part. The one that still remembered the first time Ted had reached for her hand. The part that whispered maybe if things had been different. But those thoughts were weakness, and weakness had no place here. It began with secrets. A misplaced email, an anonymous message to a journalist, a document left where it shouldn't be. Ted's business, the one that funded their perfect life, was not as spotless as he pretended. Nicole knew that, because she had helped him hide the flaws. And now, she began to unhide them, one by one. At first, it was small. A leak that seemed accidental. A file misdirected to the wrong person. But as the days passed, the leaks grew bolder, and the cracks in Ted's empire deepened. Meanwhile, Shanice found herself trapped in a maze of rumors. Her charity work questioned, her image tainted by whispers of manipulation and deceit. She blamed Ted, then Nicole, then herself, but the damage was already done. The gated world that had once adored her began to pull back, suspicious, judgmental. She could feel the ground shifting under her designer heels. Ted's temper worsened. His calls became frantic, his voice hoarse from shouting at invisible enemies. He didn't know where the attacks were coming from, but deep down, some instinct told him the source was closer than he dared admit. Nicole, watching from across the room, sometimes caught his reflection in the glass. The man she saw wasn't the one she'd loved. He looked hollow, panicked, cornered. It should have satisfied her. It didn't. Because revenge, she realized, didn't cure betrayal. It only prolonged it. Yet she couldn't stop. The momentum was too strong, like being pulled by a current she herself had created. Her emotions had fused into something colder, more dangerous than hate, a kind of moral detachment that allowed her to watch their destruction as though she were merely an observer. One night, the three of them ended up in the same room again. Not by accident, but by the gravitational pull of unfinished ruin. The lights were dim, the storm outside scraping its nails across the windows. Shanice stood near the doorway, trembling but defiant, while Ted tried to compose himself amid the chaos of papers, shattered glass, and half-spilled secrets. Nicole felt the air between them vibrate with everything unsaid. There were no words, only the sound of their collective breathing, ragged, broken. The walls seemed to close in. Every lie, every kiss, every act of betrayal echoed through the silence. Ted looked at Nicole as though searching for the woman he used to know. But that woman was gone. What stood before him was a reflection of all his sins, shaped into flesh and fury. Outside, thunder cracked. Inside, the truth finally solidified: this wasn't about love anymore. It never had been. It was about power, about control, about who could endure the most pain and still keep standing. Nicole realized she had already won that battle. She had outlasted them both. But victory came with emptiness. Watching Ted crumble and Shanice fall apart didn't fill the void, it only deepened it. The revenge she had imagined as liberation felt like another kind of prison. The life she'd burned down left only ashes, and in those ashes, she could still see the outline of what once was laughter, tenderness, a future that would never come. She walked out before either of them could stop her. The rain hit her face like shards of glass, but she didn't flinch. Behind her, the mansion glowed faintly in the storm, its lights flickering like dying stars. She didn't turn back. There was nothing left to save. Days later, when the scandals broke, when Ted's company imploded and Shanice disappeared from the public eye, Nicole was nowhere to be found. Some said she fled the country. Others whispered she'd taken her own life. But those who knew her best believed something else, that she'd simply stepped beyond the gates she'd once been trapped within, leaving behind the ghosts of two people who had destroyed themselves long before she ever had to lift a hand. For Ted and Shanice, the punishment continued long after. Every night, they saw her face in their dreams, not as a victim, not even as an avenger, but as a mirror, the proof that love, when corrupted, could become the most exquisite form of ruin. And somewhere, far away, Nicole breathed freely for the first time in years. But freedom, she discovered, was quieter than she expected, not triumph, not peace, only the faint echo of what it cost her to get there. The storm had passed, but the world felt heavier. The Dupree estate stood in silence, its grand hall stripped of warmth, mirrors veiled with dust, laughter replaced by the low hum of memory. Ted wandered through it like a ghost trapped in daylight. His empire was gone, his name had become a headline of disgrace. Shanice had vanished, her face erased from every screen that once adored her. What remained was the echo of choices none of them could undo. Nicole had disappeared without a trace. No one saw her leave, no one knew where she went. Yet the city whispered about her, stories of a woman who burned everything and walked away unscathed. But Nicole was not unscathed. Somewhere far beyond the gates, in a small coastal town where no one knew her name, she lived quietly, surrounded by the endless sound of the sea. Each wave seemed to confess something she could not: guilt, longing, the hollow relief of survival. In the evenings, she sat by the window watching the horizon dissolve into darkness. She told herself she had won, that vengeance was justice. But victory tasted like salt and sorrow. The faces of Ted and Shanice haunted her not out of fear, but recognition. They had been part of her, mirrors of her weakness, her desire to be seen, to be chosen. Destroying them had been like tearing out pieces of herself. She wrote letters she never sent, fragments of truth folded into the quiet. In them, she admitted the unbearable truth: she had loved too fiercely, too blindly, and when love betrayed her, she had turned it into fire. The fire had done its work. It had purified and destroyed, but it had not healed. One night, as the wind carried the scent of rain, Nicole walked down to the shoreline. The tide was rising, restless and cold. She stood there, feeling the waves pull at her feet, the horizon stretching endlessly before her. For the first time, she wasn't angry. The rage had burned out, leaving only the ache of what she once believed love could be. She closed her eyes and let the sea's rhythm steady her breath. In that silence, she understood, revenge had never been about punishment. It had been about reclaiming the power to feel, even if that feeling was pain. And now, as dawn broke in faint gold over the water, Nicole let the past sink beneath the waves. She would not return to the gates, nor to the ghosts behind them. She would carry them within her, the love, the betrayal, the ruin, as proof that she had lived, and that somewhere within the ashes, a fragment of herself still longed to begin again.